I won 8 Grand Slams. I held the #1 ranking. I completed the career Grand Slam every major, every surface. By any measure, I had a career most players only dream about. And yet, the men I think about most aren't the ones I beat. They're the ones who broke me open, the ones who walked onto a court and, without saying a single word, told me exactly who I was and who I wasn't. 6 rivals, 6 mirrors, none of them easy, all of them necessary. This is what they taught me. Let me start with Stefan, because Stefan was the first man who made me feel like my game had a ceiling. I came up believing that if you hit the ball hard enough, deep enough, early enough, you control the point. That was my religion. And for most opponents, it worked. But Stefan didn't care about my religion. He served and he came to the net every single time. Not because he was being aggressive, because that was simply where he lived. The net wasn't a tactic for Stefan. It was home. And the problem with someone who lives at the net is that all your best ground strokes suddenly become setups for his best volleys. I'd hit what I thought was a winner, deep, heavy, exactly where I wanted it, and Stefan would be there already, cutting it off, redirecting it into a corner I couldn't reach. It was like arguing with someone who keeps changing the language mid-conversation. What made it worse was how calm he was about it. No emotion, no celebration, just relentless, elegant, forward pressure. Stefan forced me to understand something uncomfortable. Being the best baseline player in the world only matters if your opponent stays on the baseline. He never did. I had to learn to think differently, to anticipate differently, to stop assuming the court belonged to me just because I was the one hitting harder. That lesson that your strengths are only strengths if your opponent allows them to be stayed with me for the rest of my career. Jim beat me once and went jogging right after, because playing me, he didn't even sweat. I heard about it, and I want to tell you, that burned. That burned for a long time. Here's what made Jim different from every other rival on this list. We grew up together. Same academy, same courts, same hallways at Bollettieri's. We weren't friends. We weren't enemies either. We were something more complicated than both two kids who knew exactly what the other one was made of before either of us had proved anything to the world. And Jim used that knowledge ruthlessly. He didn't have one weapon that destroyed you. He had something harder to deal with. He had everything at a level that never gave you a moment to breathe. The topspin was heavy. The fitness was inhuman. The baseline depth never let up. There was no weakness to attack, no pattern to exploit. You just had to survive, and Jim was very good at making sure you didn't. The French Open final in '91 was the moment it became real for me. I was the favorite. I genuinely believed I was going to win that tournament. And then Jim took me apart over 5 sets while my coach sat in the player's box saying absolutely nothing useful during the breaks. Meanwhile, Jim's coach had completely changed his tactics by the second set. I lost that match before I even understood what was happening. What Jim taught me was brutal and simple. Preparation beats talent every time, without exception. We're friends now. We play exhibitions together, laugh about the old days. Funny how that works. The rivals who hurt you most are sometimes the ones you end up respecting most. I'll be honest with you, I didn't like Michael. Every time he won a point, he pointed to the sky. He thanked God, credited God for the win. And I remember thinking that God should take sides in a tennis match, that God should be in Michael's box and not mine. Felt ludicrous and insulting. Now look, I understand what he was doing. I understand it wasn't about me. We actually attended Bible study together early in our careers. But on a tennis court, in the middle of a match, when a man drops to his knees and credits a higher power for every point he wins against you, something inside you reacts, something primal. And Michael knew exactly how to make that reaction work against you. Because here's what people don't talk about enough. Michael was one of the most psychologically suffocating opponents in the history of this sport. He never gave up a point, never. He ran down everything. He pushed the ball back one more time when every logical instinct told you the point was over. He played like a man who genuinely believed losing was not an option God had written for him that day. That kind of belief is almost impossible to break. There's something I've never been comfortable talking about publicly. At the Australian Open in '96, I lost to Michael on purpose. I tanked the match because the alternative was facing Boris in the next round, and I wasn't ready for that fight. But losing deliberately is almost harder than winning. You have to do it in such a way that nobody in that stadium can tell. Michael didn't know, the crowd didn't know, but I knew. And carrying that has been its own kind of punishment. The first time I saw Boris walk onto a court, I understood immediately why everyone was afraid of him. Legs as wide as my waist, hair the color of a new penny, and a serve that came at you like something that wasn't entirely legal. He beat me the first 3 times we played, and after the third loss, I made myself a promise. I was going to figure Boris out if it was the last thing I did. So I watched tape, hundreds of hours of tape. I watched him serve against every opponent I could find, and somewhere in all those hours I noticed something. Just before Boris tossed the ball, his tongue moved. If it stayed in the center of his lip, the serve was going down the middle. If it shifted to the side, the serve was going wide. Every single time, without exception. Now I want you to understand what I just told you. I could read Boris's serve before he hit it, which means the hardest part of playing him was no longer returning his serve. The hardest part was pretending I couldn't. I had to resist the temptation on every single point. I had to lose rallies I could have won just to protect the secret. And I had to choose the exact right moments, the moments that broke matches open, to use what I knew. Then came 1995. Boris had been talking to the press, saying things about me that I didn't appreciate. I circled that year on my calendar and called it my summer of revenge. We met in the semifinals of the US Open. Boris came out and won the first 2 sets. Then, at some point during the third set, he looked up at the stands and blew a kiss toward Brooke, my girlfriend, sitting in the box, right there on center court, in front of everyone. Something shifted in me at that moment, something cold and very focused. I won the next 3 sets. Afterward, years later, sitting over a beer after we'd both retired, I finally told him about the tongue. Boris went quiet. Then he started laughing so hard he nearly fell off his chair. He said, "Every time I lost to you, I told my wife you were reading my mind." I said, "I was reading your tongue." That's Boris. Even the story of how I beat him is one of the best stories I've ever told. By the time Pat and I started playing each other seriously, the whole world had moved to the baseline. Top spin, power, depth, that was the language of modern tennis. Everyone spoke it. Everyone except Pat. Pat Rafter was the last of a dying breed. A serve and volley player in an era that had decided serve and volley was finished. And he didn't just survive with that game, he thrived with it. He made it look like the rest of us were the ones doing something wrong. Here's what made Pat genuinely difficult. He was never where you expected him to be. Every rally, before you had finished deciding where to hit the ball, Pat was already at the net, already cutting off the angle, already taking away the shot you hadn't even played yet. Against most opponents, a good return buys you time. Against Pat, a good return just meant he had to hit a slightly harder volley. We met 3 consecutive years in the Wimbledon semifinals. He beat me twice in 5 sets. Those were brutal matches, long, physical, emotionally exhausting. And yet, I want to tell you something about those losses. During one of our Wimbledon matches, I accidentally hit an overhead directly into Pat's back, hard. He turned around and instead of glaring at me, he just laughed, genuinely laughed. In the middle of a Grand Slam semifinal, that moment told me everything I needed to know about who Pat was as a human being. Losing to Pat hurt, but I never once walked off that court feeling like I lost to someone who didn't deserve it. Some rivals make you bitter. Pat just made you better. I saved Pete for last. Not because he was an afterthought, because some rivalries deserve to be the final word. Pete and I were opposites in every way that mattered. I wore bright colors. I played with emotion on my sleeve. I needed the crowd, needed the drama, needed to feel something to play my best tennis. Pete was the opposite of all of that. He was quiet, contained, almost mechanical in the way he went about his business. Journalists once wrote that Pete was boring. Pete used it in a pizza commercial. That tells you everything about how comfortable he was in his own skin. I envied that more than I ever admitted publicly. Here's what made Pete the most difficult opponent I ever faced. He didn't just beat you, he made you feel smaller. There were moments in our matches, moments when I genuinely believed I had him, when the momentum had shifted and the crowd was with me, and then Pete would produce something, one serve, one forehand, one passing shot that had absolutely no right to land where it landed. And in that single moment, the entire match changed. You could feel it. The air changed, your legs changed. He had this extraordinary ability to make you feel like everything you had just built meant nothing. I told an interviewer once, my career would have been way better off without Pete, but I would have been less. That's the truest thing I've ever said about another tennis player. What people don't understand about Pete and me is how lonely we both were on tour. We traveled the same weeks every year, lived parallel lives in parallel hotel rooms, fought each other across every surface on every continent, and somehow never quite became what you'd call close friends. Not really. We respected each other enormously, but there was always this wall. Maybe that wall is what made the rivalry work. Our last match was the US Open final in 2002. Pete won. He played beautifully that day, the way he always played when it mattered most, and then he walked off the court and never came back. No announcement, no farewell tour, just gone. On his own terms, in his own way. I always respected that about him. In the end, Pete did everything on his own terms, including making my career simultaneously harder and greater than it ever could have been without him. So who was the toughest? I'm not going to give you a name, because after everything I've just told you, I think you already understand why that question misses the point. Stefan taught me my limits. Jim taught me preparation. Michael taught me about the darkness inside competition. Boris taught me that information is only power when you know when to use it. Pat taught me grace. Pete taught me who I was. 6 different lessons, 6 different mirrors. The toughest rival you'll ever face is the version of yourself that those 6 men forced you to become.